U.S. President Donald Trump has given a speech to a joint session of Congress in Washington, D.C. In a nearly 2-hour-long address, Trump claimed his trade policies and tariffs would boost the domestic agriculture and auto sectors. He vowed to reduce bureaucracy, thanking Elon Musk for cracking down on federal spending. On foreign policy, Trump said Ukraine is willing to enter peace talks. He also repeated his plan for the U.S. to take control of Greenland and the Panama Canal. So let's take a look at how Trump opened his speech with a big claim about his achievements so far.
6 weeks ago, I stood beneath the dome of this Capitol and proclaimed the dawn of the golden age of America. From that moment on, it has been nothing but swift and unrelenting action to usher in the greatest and most successful era in the history of our country. We have accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
So that gives you a sense of the tone of Trump's speech. Let's get across to Washington, D.C. with Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber. He's got the very latest for us. Benjamin, this was an address to Americans after 6 turbulent weeks in office. Tell us more about what Trump emphasized.
Turbulent, I think, is a quite fitting term to speak about this last couple of weeks covering this new administration. There were many memorable moments from the speech that was the longest presidential address to Congress in history, not only by things that the president said, but also by reaction of the attendees. Trump defended his tariffs against Mexico and Canada by saying there will be a little disturbance, but that's okay, especially also referring or talking to some Republicans that also have voiced rather some concerns on what that would mean. He even went further, saying the tariffs are, as he called it, protecting the soul of our country. It remains to be seen if that will help critics on both sides of the aisle to actually agree to this tariffs. Trump praised what his government has achieved in this 43 days, as we just heard him comparing it to other administrations. But if we look at the main talking points, many of the things that he said were repeated from other rallies that we've been covering before he won the presidential election, putting, especially domestically, a focus on economy, on bureaucracy, on the work that this Department of Government Efficiency has been doing, and also on what this administration has been doing to tackle irregular migration on the southern border.
And on foreign policy, a few things we've heard of from Trump before, too, right? Greenland and Panama back in the limelight. Trump talking about the U.S. seizing that foreign territory.
That's right, and the president was quite clear on that. He said, we're going to get it one way or another. That's what President Trump said on Greenland, adding that the island is important not just for national but also for international security. He once again claimed that the U.S. would, what he said, is reclaiming the Panama Canal, which he adds was built for U.S. citizens. And Trump once again wrongly claimed that this transfer of power over the Panama Canal from the U.S. to Panama was a gift. It was actually a result of lengthy negotiations, Claire.
Yeah. What about Ukraine? Has he said something on that subject, which is, of course, of great interest these days since the Trump administration paused military aid?
And also after that meeting last Friday with Ukrainian President Zelensky, who was kicked out by the White House, where he was also supposed to sign this mineral deal. There were some reports that he might touch on that, but he did not mention this mineral deal. Trump repeated the false claim that the U.S. is spending more on Ukraine than Europe. He also mentioned wrong numbers on the amount that the United States has actually spent on Ukraine. Trump says that the U.S. has spent $350 billion, but the Pentagon calculated it's around $183 billion. But in Ukraine, there was no new policy announcement, nothing on this mineral agreement, that there were rumors that he might announce it. He only said that President Zelensky sent Donald Trump a letter today signaling that Kyiv is now ready for negotiations to end this war.
And President Trump was speaking to a very divided Congress. We saw Democrats in the opposition. They're protesting in various ways, including some lawmakers walking out in the middle of the speech. Do you think this was effective?
There were several protests by the Democrats. They mounted a protest that started even before the speech when House and Senate Democratic leaders did not join the escort committee for the president. That's one of the traditions. Some Democrats turned their back on Trump when he entered the chamber. Others held up signs, with some signs reading Save Medicare, others reading Musk steals. Some of them walked out in the middle of the speech, so not all of them stayed until the end. And I'd say what was one of the most remarkable moments when Democratic Senator for Texas, Al Green, was escorted out by the House Sergeant-at-Arms for interrupting Trump for an extended period, something that leaders of the party urged members not to do. The White House immediately picked up on the lack of applause from Democrats. They sent out a long email after the speech. They called it Democrats showed whose side they're on, and it's not the American people. But if we look at how this was received by both Republicans and Democrats, how Democrats reacted during the speech, there was a poll by CNN saying that a majority thinks that representatives interrupting the speech was rather inappropriate. And it remains to be seen if this actually backfires for the Democrats, who have been struggling to actually keep up with many accusing the opposition of not doing enough to fight back. Just to give you one example, the reshaping of the U.S. federal government.
Well, thank you so much for that update. We've been speaking with our correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber in Washington, D.C. And plenty more to discuss here with Brandon Bourne here with me in the studio. He's a political analyst with the Bertelsmann Foundation's Europe program, where he focuses on U.S. politics and foreign policy. Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you.
We've got a lot to talk about. Greenland, Trump saying the U.S. would take it over one way or the other. What did you make of this and of his speech more widely?
Well, I think, Greenland, something to consider is going back even to Trump's first presidency, he's had an interest in Greenland. I think 2019, he actually first mentioned wanting to purchase Greenland from Denmark. Do I anticipate some sort of military operation in the near future? No, but I do anticipate more pressure on Denmark and Greenland to increase maybe a U.S. military presence there. Greenland remains an incredibly important piece of U.S. foreign policy, from minerals, from U.S. force posture. I think my main takeaway from the speech was one of just surprise at how normal it seemed, routine. I think for the average American tuning in, it just seemed like business as normal, and it masked what is happening behind the scenes, the democratic backsliding taking place, the actions of Musk, rule of law being ignored. Those things are being ignored. It's far too normal, seemingly.
And tariffs also featured here. This is a core part of Trump's economic plan. Is it something that U.S. voters will eventually feel crunched by?
Well, that's what almost all analyses say. I mean, I think something to consider is behind the scenes, there's a lack of unity even within Trump's team about the tariffs. Whether it's price fluctuations, or currency fluctuations, stock market dives, the impacts will be felt by the American consumer. Inflation has risen since Trump became president. Consumer prices are not going down. Those are the things that got him elected in the first place. And this is actually, I think, a chance for the Democrats going into the 2026 midterms. If those two key items are not taken care of by this administration, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, tell me more about the Democrats and where they stand in all of this. What kind of opposition have we seen from them?
Well, I think Al Green, who we just heard about, is an exception to the rule. As was mentioned, I think Pelosi had said we want to keep things relatively subtle with the opposition during this speech. But what you notice is that there's a lack of unity within the party. I mean, you have Illinois Governor Pritzker providing an impassioned speech, a full press approach to this administration, and then Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, saying we need to pick our battles. There seems to be a disconnect within the party about how to approach this administration. I think the choice to include Senator Slotkin, the new Michigan senator, as the person to offer the rebuttal speech to Trump was a good decision, someone who's an up-and-coming player in a state. She won in a state that Trump won last year in November. So, she offered a pretty clear a vision as a moderate Democrat about the economic challenges that Americans are facing. And those are the key issues that Democrats will have to focus on leading into the 2026 midterms.
Well, Brandon, thank you so much for joining us in the studio today with your insights. We've been speaking with Brandon Bourne from the Bertelsmann Foundation. And we can get the view from Brussels now with our bureau chief, Alexandra van Namen. Alexandra, it has been an intense few days for European politicians, especially on the issue of Ukraine. How do you think this speech by Donald Trump will have been received at the EU level?
Well, I think it's fair to say that EU officials here in Brussels and lawmakers as well are probably relieved that there were no new bombshells in Donald Trump's speech, no new policy announcements that could further hurt the transatlantic relationship. However, of course, what he had to say, the things that he repeated in his address, like the fact that he vowed to seize Greenland, an autonomous territory that is part of Denmark, a fellow NATO country, that it's still very concerning, not only for the Nordic nation, but for the whole of the European Union. And then the fact that he is still planning to impose tariffs on products coming out of the European Union is something that nobody here wants. They, of course, don't want a full-blown trade war. So all of that still very concerning. And, of course, the fact that the U.S. has put the military aid for Ukraine on a hold. And that is also not good news for the European Union. And they are still scrambling to find an answer to that.
Absolutely not. Yeah, let's talk more about that, Alexandra. Stay with us for just a moment while we take a closer look at the issue. Ukraine did not really figure prominently in Trump's speech. However, earlier on Tuesday, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that his country is ready to work toward a lasting peace under what he called Trump's, quote, strong leadership. And he said Kyiv's ready to sign a minerals deal with the U.S. Now, Zelensky's comments are an attempt to rebuild ties after the U.S. suspended all military aid for Ukraine. Let's look now at how Ukrainians see the situation.
It's business as usual for these Ukrainian combat medics. They're being trained and prepared in the frontline Kharkiv region. For instructor and former U.S. Marine Arturo, Trump's decision to suspend aid to Ukraine is an error.
The Trump administration has been pushing for lasting peace, and the reason the aid stopped is because they said that they don't believe Ukraine is looking for peace. We know that Ukraine wants peace, but we've seen what peace with Russia looks like in the past couple of years. They break treaties, they start wars, they blame NATO expansionism. Meanwhile, they expand themselves through force.
The shift in U.S. policy has been met with a mixture of reactions from these Ukrainian soldiers.
It's a bit strange to read the news and compare what it was like at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion and the surrealism that's happening now. At first, the US were with us, and now they don't even want to recognize that Russia is an aggressor. In fact, the US has switched sides.
It hasn't affected my morale much. On the contrary, it motivates me. You're always hoping for someone's help. At the moment, I understand that we are on our own. And it motivates me to do something, to keep fighting.
Several hundred kilometers away in the capital, Kyiv, the change of gear from Washington has divided opinion.
I still think we can win, but we'll need more help from Europe.
America has become a selfish country. They're dropping Ukraine and they're dropping Europe. We need to get closer to Europe.
Our leaders are to blame for most of it. We're so dependent on outside support. They should have been more diplomatic.
I'm happy that America has stopped the aid, because that will stop the war. If you stop refueling a car, eventually it will stop.
But for now, and despite Donald Trump's impatience, the war shows no sign of ending.
So back to Alexandra van Namen in Brussels now. Alexandra, EU leaders have really been jolted into action here. They say they have a plan for the war in Ukraine and its needs for the weapons as the U.S. pulls back. What more can you tell us about it?
Well, I think it's important, Claire, to stress that all the plans that are on the table still need to be finalized. Let's take France, for instance. They are working together with the UK to propose a plan for a truce in Ukraine to stop the fighting there. But that still needs to be finalized and also approved by the United States. And we are probably going to hear more about that from the French president, who is planning to address his nation this evening. And then when we talk about Europe's own defense spending and their support, military support for Ukraine, yesterday Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, presented a plan that is meant to mobilize up to 800 billion euros for Europe's own defense and for the assistance for Ukraine. And we are talking there about new tools, the relaxing of quite strict debt rules for members of the European Union, but also public and private funding that is aimed to boost the spending of the member states on defense. But all of that will need time, still needs to be approved by the members of the European Union. And the big question is, will it reach the battlefields in Ukraine on time to help the Ukrainian soldiers there?
Alexandra van Namen in Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we can pick up on this now with our chief international editor, Richard Walker, here with me in the studio. Hi, Richard. A wide-ranging speech from Trump here, right? What stood out most to you?
Yeah, well, Claire, I mean, we don't often use the term conventional when talking about Donald Trump, but in a way, for his standards, this was quite a conventional speech. You know, he's not somebody to be shy about what he sees as his achievements. And at the beginning of the speech, we heard clips there as well, you know, essentially saying that his administration is off to a racing start on a kind of a mission of national greatness, essentially. And a lot of the speech was domestic in focus. A lot of the speech focused on areas that were important to him on the campaign trail, kind of culture war issues relating to woke, relating to transgender rights, relating to critical race theory, you know, issues like that. And then really kind of topping and tailing the beginning and the end of the speech, very much in this sense of, yeah, national mission and his role in that, almost like a sense of divine destiny. You know, I mean, he said this in his inaugural address as well. You know, I was saved by God at that assassination attempt in Pennsylvania last year to make America great again. And then ending with God's help, we are going to forge the most dominant civilization ever to exist on the face of this earth. Wow. So, I mean, really big stuff, fusing his own personality with this sort of national mission of dominance, now he says. Of course, that's also not necessarily new, but I think maybe what was quite interesting coming through is there were in a few sections where you could see an implicit, like between the lines, an acknowledgement that there are some vulnerabilities in some areas that could stand in the way to that.
Yeah, what are the vulnerabilities you think that Trump has clocked and might be nervous about?
So I think there are probably kind of three baskets of that, like two of them economic. So first of all, referring to tariffs, you know, so tariffs has been a huge part of his campaign. You know, you remember during the campaign last year, he would often say, and he said again today, tariff is a beautiful word. And he sees this as a kind of all-purpose tool to fix things. And he announced new tariffs yesterday. But he got an immediate fright from the markets. Yeah? The markets were tumbling. And by the end of the day yesterday, his Commerce Secretary was indicating that maybe there would be a compromise with Mexico and Canada already today. Trump referred to that in his speech as there'll be a little disturbance here or there, but we're OK with that. I mean, for Trump to acknowledge something like a disturbance, I think, is one indication there. And also there was a lot of talk, the second economic point, he did a lot of talk about how much money Elon Musk and his so-called DOGE, this Department of Government Efficiency, how much money that was going to save in cutting spending. And I think with often very exaggerated claims about the scope of that to really cut spending. And I think this points to an acknowledgement that there's a vulnerability in terms of America's debt, that the US is forecast to have a higher deficit this year. It's been running high deficits throughout the Biden term as well. And there could be concerns on the markets that this is just getting to be too much, particularly if Trump goes through with his plans to continue with tax cuts that he started with, that favour very much the wealthiest Americans, and could lead to those deficits ballooning even further.
And Richard, perhaps what was also interesting, what was not said, no real major foreign policy announcements, and that must be a relief to Europeans watching, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I think Europeans are now, they're so sort of shell-shocked by the last few weeks. There will be some relief that there were no fresh bombshells, of course, after the latest one being that Trump is hitting the pause button, at least, on military aid to the Ukrainians. And also Trump making conciliatory noises towards Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, who published on social media yesterday a very conciliatory message also after their blow-up in the White House last week. So I think there will be some relief in Europe that potentially will cool down again, but as quickly as it cools down, it can easily heat up again. And I think this has been the lesson of these last few weeks.
Absolutely. Richard, thank you for joining us with that analysis. We've been speaking to our Chief International Editor, Richard Walker.
And let's bring in Aaron Carl. He's the Lee H. Hess Director of Debate at the University of Michigan. Thank you very much for being on DW News. Tell us a bit about what you took away from that 1 hour, 39-minute speech from President Trump, I believe a record.
Yes, a modern-day record for sure. President Bill Clinton previously had the record of about an hour and a half, but President Trump eclipsed that, and he's known for giving long speeches, sometimes going off the teleprompter, and I think we saw that tonight. The very beginning of the speech was interrupted a little bit by the heckling of Democratic Congressman Al Green and his escorting out of Congress. But overall, I think it was a speech for Republicans, for his base of supporters. He, at the very outset, kind of said that no matter what he says, Democrats are not going to support him. They gave him a cold reception as he entered the Congress and really never applauded really anything in tonight's address, even some things that had some bipartisan appeal and very persuasive people in the crowd. And I think that just shows the tensions that exist in politics in America because of tariffs and all the federal job layoffs and things like that. And so I think President Trump remains kind of really committed to just getting his agenda done on a party line vote and continue to kind of speak to his most fervent supporters. And just like the inauguration address, this was just a continuation of that method.
Yep, it was interesting seeing that brutal divide in American politics. It was also interesting listening to a lot of domestic policy, and an hour and a half in, with just 9 minutes to go, Ukraine was mentioned very, very briefly. What does that tell you? I mean, that's a huge topic for him right now, isn't it?
It is, especially given what happened in the Oval Office on Friday and the aftermath that it's caused in the last several days. But these addresses to Congress are disproportionately talking about domestic issues. And he was elected mostly because of the economy, inflation. And, I think his focus tonight really showed that to be the case. There was some talk earlier today about maybe that minerals deal getting done in advance of the speech. And if that were to happen, I think that Ukraine would have been a more prominent part. But there were some complications there. And because of that uncertainty, it made it to the very end of a lengthy speech. The most important part is the very beginning. People are asleep. They have to go to work the next day. So many of the audience, which is going to be millions, tens of millions of people, probably were not even still tuned in by the end, just given the attention spans and reality. So I think the immigration and the economy probably really were the focus. He tried to spend some time explaining the rationale for tariffs and immigration, social hot button issues, the things he's done via executive order. That was the heart of the speech and got the most applause lines and is probably maybe most important for a lot of his supporters and base. And I think he understands that politically in things like the Middle East, in Ukraine, Russia, China, it got little time, and the time that it did was at the very tail end of the speech, showing the kind of lack of importance, especially in relation to the other domestic issues.
Aaron, can I just ask you really briefly, a large part of Trump's address focused on the economy, tariffs, US business interests. What is his America First policy looking like in concrete terms?
Yeah, right now it's very uncertain. His job approval ratings on the economy are below even his general job approval ratings. Inflation remains stubborn, prices too high, tariffs increase prices on things like the automobiles, the egg prices remain high. And so given his business background, economic background, I think people have expected a little bit more action. You saw tonight, he blamed a lot of that on the presidency of Joe Biden. He's going to get a little honeymoon period for maybe a few more weeks or months, but eventually he's going to have to take action, be either the executive order or congressional legislation, which is tougher to address these lingering economic concerns, or else the next elections, especially as we get into the midterm elections in 2026, are not going to go well for Republicans because the economy always remains the number one issue in American politics.
Yeah, he also blamed his woes on what he called the worst inflation ever. But you just have to take a quick look at the figures, and inflation peaked at 6.5% or so after the pandemic back in September 22. And we saw much worse inflation back in 1970 and in 1778. We've got to leave it there. Good talking to you.
Anytime. Take care.